Reconstruction and Development in Afghanistan, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. In his long-awaited review of U.S. strategy in Afghanistan, General Stanley McChrystal emphasized the need to make protection of the Afghan people against the Taliban the top priority. In addition to improving the physical security situation, he suggested that a key aspect in the fight against the insurgency must be the delivery of basic services. Experts worry that Taliban militants are filling gaps left by the government and winning support by running courts, hospitals, and other activities key to life at the local level. A senior advisor to General McChrystal recently observed, quote, "A government that is losing to a counterinsurgency isn't being outfought, it is being outgoverned, and that's what's happening in Afghanistan," unquote. To help us examine efforts to rebuild and develop Afghanistan, we're pleased to be joined in the studio by Michael Tobin, an attorney and retired colonel in the Wisconsin Army National Guard, who worked with the Afghan, NATO, and UN officials to help Afghanistan establish the system of civilian justice envisioned in its constitution. He currently serves as Executive Director of Milwaukee's Fire and Police Commission. We're also joined by phone by Frederick Barton, Senior Advisor in the Center for Strategic and International Studies International Security Program and co-director of its Post-Conflict Reconstruction Project. Well, welcome both of you to International Focus.
Thank you very much.
Rick, I want to start with you and ask you a question about the question, which is the media, the Congress, many are concerned with the question of, do we have or should we send more troops to Afghanistan? And I want to put that question, about the question to you, which is that the right question right now that we should be focusing on?
It's an important question, but I happen to believe that the critical question is, how do we reach a responsible national leadership in Afghanistan that takes full responsibility for their own future? And the question of additional troops then should be framed in this way. Will the addition of additional troops help us to reach that moment? I think there's been a progression over the last few years, both in Afghanistan and in foreign capitals, that President Karzai has really been losing energy and losing public support, and has not really shown that he is going to be the leader or a leader that's going to produce this kind of national ownership. And the only thing that you can say about the election that I think would be universally agreed upon is that President Karzai has shown a great deal of energy in this election. Some of it has not been positive, but if he could direct the same effort to leading his country into this sense of full responsibility, then I think we would all be encouraged. Additional troops may be helpful, but probably only for a limited time. They will only be helpful if there is a sense that the Afghans are willing to fight and negotiate for their own future and can do that in a skillful way. They're not fighting a crack military outfit in the Taliban, but they are showing that they're losing the confidence of the people.
Well, there are those that would say that even if more troops, or the troops that are there, U.S., coalition, Afghan, are able to significantly quell the Taliban and the insurgency, that you're left with a government that is corrupt at all levels, at the federal, the provincial, and the local levels, and that until that problem is maybe the straw that's breaking the camel's back, that people don't believe that that can be solved, and therefore the troop increase may not be useful. So how do we, once if Karzai is able to lead better, what do we do about the rest of the system, the provincial and the local levels?
Well, Karzai still has a tremendous amount of influence over the rest of the political system, and the governors in particular. The last time that I heard kind of a survey of the governors, there were a handful of governors that were rather universally admired And then there were an equal handful, maybe a few more, who were thought to be completely corrupt, and then a vast number of them were sort of in the middle, a kind of a bell curve. That's probably still the case, and that's going to be true. There are obviously ministries in Kabul that are working quite well. The health ministry has a good reputation. The National Solidarity Program, which is designed to let local communities take the initiative, and the funding goes directly to the communities. So it can be done, but there really isn't this sense that these leaders in Kabul will fight for their country. There's a feeling that they might well leave to join their families that are often offshore in the United States or around Washington or wherever they happen to be, and that's really that's not a motivating force.
What are those that will say, you know, look, Afghanistan has never had a strong central government. It's been dominated by warlords or foreign powers for most of its history, that we kind of can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again?
Yeah, I don't think that. I think that we spent way too much time trying to build from the center out, and that's, I think, in many cases the result of the United States going into these countries as the federal government. So we have people who have a Washington perspective, whereas really most people in the United States have to live with their local government and their state government much more than they do the national government. Of course, I don't mean to suggest any of them are unimportant, but there's a pretty good balance. We haven't really figured out how to do that in many of these conflict places, and as a result, we don't develop the talent at the local level that is necessary, because these places have really been robbed of their talent. Anybody who really had ability has, in many cases, run from the country or been killed. And so you have to see these early days as opportunities to just give people tests and see who meets those tests, whether it's a local police chief or whether it's a governor or whether it's a cabinet officer. So I think our construct just doesn't fit in many of these places. So we don't have to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, but we do have to make the average Afghan has to feel as if they're safe. And I think that's the calculation that we're going through right now. Can we best do that by having a fairly robust, probably not the necessary number, but maybe a more effectively deployed international force that will complement a growing but still very immature domestic force. And then in a year and a half, when many of our allies, like the Dutch and Canadians, have already said they're going to leave, there will be the capability there. And then should we heighten the attention of local people by saying the United States is also going to set a date, which would then, I think, really make it clear that the responsibility for leadership, fighting, and negotiation is local.
Well, let's talk about the timing issue. I mean, you mentioned setting a date, and many are pointing to the dip in public opinion polls in terms of support for the war, linking to the fact that it has been a long time, that they're weary from having also been involved in Iraq, and seeing the counterinsurgency or the shift in the counterinsurgency tactics in Iraq pay pretty quick dividends. And there are maybe those who are saying, well, you know, yeah, if we can stick it out for 6 months or so, what do you advise in terms of the expected time frame that we should be looking at here?
I think there are two time frames. I think the length of the U.S. military commitment in terms of having soldiers on the ground that are really leading the fight, I think that should be much more finite. I think we have become a convenience of sort for the ruling the ruling elites in the government of Afghanistan. So my feeling is that it would really help to have a date in 2011 or whenever our allies have already set. Maybe lengthen it out a little bit, but make sure that it's clear that it's going to end. And then the second timeline is one of that will require U.S. and international support for many years to help pay for the new Afghan military, for their police, for the creation of a system of governance, because the country basically has about a $500 million a year revenue base, and that won't even pay for the existing Afghan army. So the difference here, if we go with this plan, is that we will be spending much less money, and we will not be losing American lives, we will still be spending a significant amount of money, but it will probably be something like $10 to $15 billion a year versus 70 to 80, which is where we are now.
Folks look at the time between 2001 and 2008 as sort of a lost time in terms of U.S. engagement with Afghanistan, with Iraq pulling resources away. And many Afghans will certainly point to the 2003 as a critical year when forces got redirected to and resources got redirected to Iraq. Some will say that too much damage has been done, that this is not that the U.S. effort, even with a change in tactics, is not going to be able to overcome the slide that has happened in the last 5 years or so. How do we reverse that, or I guess more bigger the question is, can we reverse that?
I think it could be reversed. I don't think that the negative slide was uniform for 5 years. There's no question that Afghanistan was in a subterranean state when the United States first went in there. It was really it had been gone through so many years of destruction, of different kinds of destruction, that it really needed to sort of go get above ground, and that happened. But then we got through the familiar, which was the return of refugees, the initial pieces of construction, the fighting of a more conventional war. And we got to a point where, okay, now what do we do? And we didn't really know what to do, and so we've lost an awful lot of momentum. We have an advantage in Afghanistan, and then we have many, many, many challenges. But one of the advantages is that it's not as if there is really a powerful and popular insurgency. The Taliban are an intimidating force, and they're using now increasingly intimidating tactics with bombers, basically landmine-type bombs and suicide bombers, and so they're getting more sophisticated in that regard. But it's not that they're winning the minds of the people. They've just scared people back to a point that they were at 8 or 9 years ago, which led them to send their families out of the country, to hide, to hunker, and to compromise. And so the intimidation has been growing. And that's one of the huge failures of not having had a reassuring presence in most of the villages and towns, or even the districts of the country. We're barely there on a kind of a base, on bases in various places, and that's just no way to make people feel comfortable at their local level.
We have just less than a minute, Rick, and I want to ask you the hardest question for the last with the least amount of time.
Okay.
What's the single biggest indicator you would have for success going forward?
I think it would be a feeling that the people are more safe and more secure in their communities, and so movements of people and behaviors which reinforce that they know that the people who have liberated them during the day are actually going to stay there overnight or stay there for several weeks. So the freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, those are the key indicators for whether people are feeling safe. And if they're not feeling safe and secure, you're not going to be able to do many of the other things.
Great. Frederick Barton from the Center for Strategic International Studies, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
To our viewers, we'll be back in just a moment on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano. We've been talking about Afghanistan. In the first part of the show, we were talking by phone to Frederick Barton of the Center for Strategic International Studies, and now we have in our studio Michael Tobin of our Police and Fire Commission here, but also someone who has played a central role in Afghanistan for a while, working on the justice system and knows many of the players there. And Mike, so I'm wondering whether we can just start open and ask what your thoughts were based on what you heard Rick Barton say.
Sure. Well, I think we got to start with the premise that, do we really understand what the mission is in Afghanistan? If the mission is defeat the insurgency, and the insurgency by that I mean Taliban, not just Taliban, but Al-Qaeda and international terrorist cells and international terrorist groups that are being attracted to Afghanistan now just to pick a fight with us. If our mission is to defeat that type of insurgency, then that should be clearly stated. That is our mission. And if it is our mission, then we need to properly resource it. And we need to do it now. There's an immediate need for it.
Mike, can I just stop you there? I like the way we're going here, but I want to get more of that. But you had said it, sort of, if it's defeating the insurgency and the multiple components of it, that has to be properly resourced. Do you have a sense of what that would mean in terms of troop levels or commitment?
Well, let's look at the historical context of it first. In the last time I was there, late 2006, early 2007, the U.S. troop levels were approximately 34,000. Today, as we sit here, there's about 62,000, about double that. By the end of the year, in another couple of months, we're going to have 68,000. So double that, double the number of troops over the past 2 years, and what results have we seen there? Last month, in the month of August, we had 51 killed in action U.S. forces. Currently today, as we sit here, we have about 747 total U.S. forces killed since October 2001. And last month, by the way, was the worst month for U.S. casualties since October 2001, since we first went into Afghanistan. So that's the historical context of we've already doubled the amount of troops that we had there just 2 years ago. And what results have we seen? The results are minimal. And I would suggest to you that the reason for that is that the troop level still is not at that point. We are now at a crossroads where we are being forced to decide. If this is our mission, then we need to properly resource it once and for all, in troops and fiscally, is what I mean by that.
And should we be thinking in terms of levels? You've mentioned doubling has not really made a big dent. I mean, is there sort of a tipping point, you know, that you have to increase up to? In other words, if you add a soldier, you don't necessarily get that incremental gain. You have to reach kind of a saturation point, and that may not be a factor. It sounds like it's not a factor of 5,000 or 10,000 more troops, but it may be much more than that.
Well, you know, I wish I could answer that, but I can't, and most military analysts cannot. And I don't think General McChrystal can answer that clearly right now with a set number, just like I don't think we can give a set date of when we want to all get on the plane and go home from that country. And the reason for that is the way we really need to approach it is give General McChrystal the conditions precedent to make the decisions on the ground based on the metrics that they've developed, based on, you have to understand in the background, operating in the background of this is a very complex and dynamic battlefield that changes from geographic location and from time and from week to week. And the commander on the ground, if our mission is to defeat the insurgency, if our mission is that, the commander on the ground, who we've authorized to do that, General McChrystal, has to have some leeway within a certain parameter to make those adjustments as the battlefield changes. And that's based on their metrics, not ours, and not on outside looking in, but by the people on the ground. I think that's a point that we've been missing in the conversation.
That the Sunday morning talk shows are using necessarily.
Maybe some of them, but and maybe not others.
Now you mentioned that so if the mission is defeating the insurgency, which is complex, multifaceted, et cetera. What are the other options for the mission? What might be some alternative ways of defining the mission?
All right. Well, I think that was originally our primary mission, but our secondary mission, and it's still one of our primary goals, is to develop and set the conditions for the host nation to sustain capacity in their government. And there's many facets of that that have been under-resourced, chronically under-resourced for the past 8 years. So if that is our secondary mission, we need to also increase our resources in those areas. And by those areas, I mean, first of all, the ANA, Afghan National Army. The Afghan National Army has been under-resourced. As of probably today, we've got about 91,000 assigned in Afghan Army. The goal is to get about 134,000, and there's a lot of questions about whether that's sustainable or not, whether that number is large enough or not. If the people of Afghanistan don't have a supportable ANA that is capable and mission capable of not only leading missions but participating in joint missions with NATO forces, and how many of them, probably less than 50% of the current ANA forces are capable of participating in joint missions, and out of that 50%, I would suggest that there's a very small percentage that are capable of leading missions independently. So developing ANA has been a very slow process, and the reason for that, one of the primary reasons, is under-resourcing. There's an urgent need for mentors and ETTs, embedded trainers, to go into that program.
Embedded training.
Embedded trainers, right, to go in there and help the Afghans and increase their the priorities with ANA. Second part is ANP, Afghan National Police. Right now, probably Afghan National Police have about 47,000 people assigned nationwide. And this is the only police force that they have. There's not a municipal, there's not a sheriff's department. The goal is to get about 82,000. These are the people that really give the local villagers, people in the smaller villages, the security and the perception of security. ANP right now is perceived as a very corrupt organization, and it's undersourced and understaffed, and there are sections of it that are not well trained. So that part of the mission we've also not succeeded in yet, and it needs to be grossly increased. For instance, and I'll give you an actual example. If you're living in a small village in Wardak Province, in western Wardak Province, and you wake up in the morning and overnight somebody nailed a letter to your door that says, you will not go and vote in the national election tomorrow. If you do, if we see you there, we will kill your wife and 2 oldest daughters. There is no policeman in that little village for you to walk down to and say, I want to make a report. You are not going to go and vote. There's no court system in that village. There's no reliable prosecution system. There's not a defense counsel. There's not a as far as security sector reform, the justice system and the judicial system, both formal and informal, is not developed to the point that people in those communities have confidence in the central government or their local government. And the reason for that is the security problem. If the security problem is not cleaned up, we will not have the rule of law and security sector and justice reform. So
this mission, which is, as you were explaining it originally, is defined not primarily in sort of military terms, but the military aspect of providing the security is key, and I think Rick Barton talked about a lot of the same indicators of, do people feel safe, and do they feel like they can have recourse to a government that's going to help them versus being a part of the problem.
Yes, and that's just part of the problem, I think, because if people don't have confidence in their government, we aren't going to go there either. NGOs are not going to go there. State Department civilians are not going to want to go there. When the bullets are flying, the only people that are there are the military. And we have limited involvement right now from international groups and NGOs. There are many, many people and organizations that are willing and trying and want to help in Afghanistan, but the security level is not safe enough for them to do so. That's why it's important to go back to the primary mission, defeat the insurgency to a level that we can bring in the civilian military assistance groups, the NGOs, more help from UNAMA, UNDP, NATO, ISAF forces, other international NGOs to help out in the reconstruction process. Because there's 3 parts about the reconstruction process that we have to think about. First is the governance part. That part is, the roads, the bridges, giving people water, food to drink, medical services, schools. The second part is rule of law. If you don't have that, you don't have a sustainable government. As I just talked about. And the third part is economics. If you don't have a revenue-based government to sustain the police and the ANA, like the guest speaker was talking about, to sustain them after we leave, it will not be, it's not a sustainable action. We've had a plan to do the reconstruction, and it's been in existence for more than 2 years. It's called the ANDS, Afghan National Development Strategy. It's also known as a 10-year plan. A plan is out there waiting to be implemented, but these groups are not able to do it because of the security program.
One of the things that also Rick mentioned, you alluded to the very geographically how conditions are different in different parts of the country and at different times, and Rick was trying to frame that a little bit almost as an asset in that there are parts where there may be some backsliding or insecurity, but it's not evenly across the country. So if your secondary mission is really focused around the population and their ability to sustain themselves, is that a possible way to create a bit of a sense of momentum here, that there are areas that have some hope?
Yes, I believe that's exactly the case, and that's why the General McChrystal has to have that flexibility in assigning troops, bringing in brigade combat teams that into different areas and adjusting them as their metrics have indicated where they're best suited. Another part that's missing that we haven't heard a lot about lately is the PRTs, the Provincial Reconstruction Teams. In Afghanistan, there's about 34 provincial reconstruction teams, maybe about one per province, that have also been very under-resourced. You know, if you go into a provincial reconstruction team, this is the one team for that province to help people develop their governance. For instance, there'll be one agriculture specialist. There'll be one governance specialist. And in some areas of Afghanistan right now, the only way they can help people is to get in an 8-person armored Humvee convoy once a week and go meet at the governor's compound with the tribal leaders, and you can't get things done that way.
We have about a minute left, and I wish we had more. But ultimately, there are those who, in the pit of their stomach, are saying, "Hey, you know, this is a quagmire, or it's potentially a quagmire." Ultimately, do you have hope that we can do this even with resources?
Here's the thing that's different now that we didn't have in the past 8 years. Well, there's two things that we have to remember. First of all, we have a team in place of leaders that we did not have before. We have General McChrystal, who was one of the experts in counterinsurgency operations. And then we have former General and now Ambassador Eikenberry, who I worked on his personal staff for a year in a combat zone, who was one of the nation's best experts on Afghanistan and the problems of Afghanistan. Those two individuals are some of the best leaders that the United States can offer right now for Afghanistan, and they've been recently in place, and they are working on their plans. The second part that we don't talk about is the Afghan people and the will of the Afghan people.
Mike Brown, Mike Tobin, I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. To our viewers, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.